Hey, welcome back. It's your boy, Mr. Taylor, here with yet another wonderful lecture. Today, we're going to get started learning all about the respiratory system. That's right. So, we're kind of skipping around a little bit here, but we just learned about the heart and the cardiovascular system. And now we're just going to go on a quick tour of the respiratory system and learn how the lungs and all their associated organs work together to help you to breathe. So, we're going to learn how to inhale and exhale. We're going to learn how to breathe. And so, just remember, if you start to get a little bit stressed out, just slow down and just breathe. All right, let's get started. All right, so a little bit of a warning before we begin. This is part one of our lecture on anatomy, and then part two is going to have the physiology and diseases. But I just want to warn you, I do have some cadaver pictures. These are actual cadaver photos that are pretty disgusting. So I'm just warning you in advance that this might be a little bit gross. So viewer discretion is advised. All right. So to begin, let's take a look at just the basic features of the respiratory system. Basically, your respiratory system is just there to help you to exchange gases. And when we talk about exchanging gases, quite literally, that's what it is. It's an exchange. Your body, because it uses a lot of oxygen, needs to bring more oxygen in. And then your cells, through cellular respiration, produce carbon dioxide. So we have to get that out. So basically, we are exchanging oxygen in the air around you for carbon dioxide. And we're also doing that inside of our tissues as well. So when we look at the respiratory processes involved in the respiratory system, there's actually a couple different places this takes place. The first one is called pulmonary ventilation. And if you remember from our last chapter on the cardiovascular system, we were saying that that pulmonary always means related to the lungs. So pulmonary ventilation is quite simply getting air in and out of your lungs. So that's what, like most of us, would call breathing. So air comes in, fills up your lungs, you do the gas exchange, and then it goes back out. The second part of respiration is what's called external respiration. And this is what happens following pulmonary ventilation. So once we get air into your lungs, then we're going to go ahead and do this exchange of gases between the capillaries that run through your lungs and the alveoli, which are the little tiny air-filled sacs or little pockets inside of your lungs. So basically, we fill the alveoli with air, and then the blood, of course, comes through the capillaries, and we're going to exchange gases between our blood and our air that's inside of our lungs. And then the third process, internal respiration, is where that blood is carried all the way through to your tissues. And then when it gets into the capillaries of your body's tissues, then it drops off all the oxygen that it's picked up from your lungs and picks up carbon dioxide and then takes that back. So basically, we have to get air in and out. We have to get oxygen through the lungs into the blood, and then we have to deliver that oxygen to your tissues. Those are the three processes. And then carbon dioxide is kind of the reverse. Once we pick up carbon dioxide in the tissues from internal respiration, we carry it back to the lungs where it gets delivered from the blood back into the air through external respiration. And then finally, you breathe it out through pulmonary ventilation. So basically, oxygen is going down from 1 to 3, and then carbon dioxide is going backwards from 3 to 1. And that's how you do it. All right, so these are all the different organs involved here. So this is where we're going to be focusing. We're going to start off with the nose and mouth and work our way all the way down the respiratory tract to the lungs. And these are kind of all your big players that you see here. And so we'll be referencing back to this diagram a lot. All right, so anatomically, we're going to start where the air enters your body, and we're going to look at the what is called the upper respiratory tract, which is the most superior portion of the respiratory tract. The first part of the upper respiratory tract is your nose and nasal cavities, and basically what we see is these are hollow cavities that are lined with pseudostratified epithelial tissue. So if you remember pseudostratified, it was fake stratified. Looked like it had many layers, but it didn't really. We're looking at these tall columnar cells. The whole reason why we use our nose to breathe is that our nose is supposed to kind of like condition the air to get it ready to go into our lungs. So when you breathe in through your nose, the air, as it goes through the tiny passageways inside of your nose, has a lot of contact between the air and the mucous membranes. And when this happens, those mucous membranes, because they're covered in this kind of like thin liquidy mucus, help to kind of like warm up and like moisten or hydrate the air before it gets into your lungs. And at the same time, all that mucus and like the hairs inside your nose and the cilia on the surface of those pseudostratified cells are all working together to kind of clean the air. So, like I said, it's conditioning. We're like warming it, we're moistening it, and we're getting all the junk out, all the dust and bacteria and everything, so that by the time it gets to your lungs, it's nice and clean. If you've ever been in a really dusty environment and like had to like blow your nose afterwards, you may have noticed that some really nasty stuff came out. That was the stuff that your nose was saving from getting into your lungs. One other thing that's interesting is, we can obviously breathe through our nose or through our mouth. And of course, breathing through your nose is preferable because, having your mouth hang open looks kind of dumb. But besides that, if you've ever gone outside in the wintertime and tried to like breathe through your nose or breathe through your mouth, you may have noticed that when you breathe through your mouth, first of all, if you suck in like a big gulp of air in cold weather, all of a sudden it'll like burn your lungs. Like it makes you want to cough. The reason for this is that you're sucking a bunch of like really dry, cold air into your lungs suddenly, which is not what your lungs like. The other thing is too, you may have noticed that when you breathe that out, all of a sudden, like all this like steam comes out. It looks like smoke almost, or like vapor. And the reason why you see all that water vapor coming out is because when you breathe out through your mouth, it's a shorter route to your lungs. And so you're not getting that warming and moistening of the air that you would normally get. And also, interestingly, when you breathe out and you exhale through your nose, all of the warm, moist air that's coming out of your lungs, you actually recollect a lot of that moisture in your nasal passageways and you recollect a lot of that heat. So, what I'm saying is that breathing through your nose helps you to retain moisture and to retain warmth and warm temperatures in the winter versus breathing through your mouth. So, in all cases, unless you're completely congested, you're better off breathing through your nose. All right, so from our nose and our nasal cavity, we get to the pharynx. And the pharynx is the technical name for your throat. Okay, so we usually use pharynx anatomically instead of throat. But if you look at this diagram, here's the nasal cavity, and you can see it's got a whole bunch of little ridges that help to increase that contact between the air and the mucous membranes. And right as we get to the back of your nasal cavity, this area in green here, we call the nasopharynx. And so the nasopharynx is the part of your throat behind your nose. So this is like in the middle of your head, but it's immediately posterior to your nasal cavity. And the nasopharynx is the beginning of this tube. And you can see we kind of form like this little like funnel almost, like where it's kind of wide, and it narrows down as we go down towards your larynx, which is down here. So the nasopharynx is like above what we call the palate. So if you guys remember, we talked about the palatine bone and the maxilla. They form this bony, hard palate. And then there's this little thing called the soft palate that dips down that's made of soft tissue. The palate is the separation between the nose and the mouth so that you don't like get food up into your nose and you don't have a bunch of like nasty mucus dropping down inside of your mouth. And so everything like pretty much above this palate is going to be this nasopharynx. And so it says here it's made with it's covered with pseudostratified columnar epithelial. And you can see that right here in this diagram. You can see all our pseudostratified with its little cilia. It goes from the nasal cavity down to that soft palate, and it's only used for air. So nothing else should be going through there. You shouldn't have like food coming up through there. I know when you laugh, sometimes it happens. But basically, if you're living your normal best life, you shouldn't have anything but air going through there. So it's just used as kind of like an air tube. Below that, in this blue area, we have this area called the oropharynx, and this is the back of your mouth. So if you open up and say ah and use like a tongue depressor and pull your tongue down, you can actually see this sticking out beyond like your tonsils. So look behind your tonsils, and you'll see this kind of like pink tissue back there. The oropharynx is made of non-keratinized stratified squamous, so many layers of thin cells. This time, the reason why we switch tissues is that the oropharynx has to carry both air and food. So this is the area from your soft palate down to this thing called your hyoid. And remember, the hyoid was this bone down here, so approximately at about that level. The oropharynx, because it has to carry both air and food, has to have a more protective function. So it has to be able to let you breathe and eat. Below that, this purple region down here is called the laryngopharynx. And this is the part of the pharynx that connects to your larynx. So it's basically, that's where it gets its name from. Also made of non-keratinized stratified squamous, just like the oropharynx, because food also carries down into here on its way down to the esophagus. And so here's the esophagus posterior to the larynx, which is your anterior air tube. And great. So that's it for the pharynx. Basically, it's a tube, and we'll talk about this later. It's like a tube or like a funnel that's going to direct air down into your larynx and direct food down into your esophagus. And we'll actually talk about this in the digestive system in a few more lessons. And here's another view showing you the same thing. So you can actually see here's your nasal passageway. You can see these little things are called the nasal conchae. We talked about these in the skeletal system. So we have the superior, inferior, and middle nasal concha. And these basically are used to help like kind of redirect the air and increase the surface area. If you remember, we had our ethmoid bone up in here, and we actually had like our little cribriform plate that allows us to smell. So our olfactory epithelium sits right up here on the top of the nasal passageway. Here's one of our sinuses that we talked about. So this is actually our sphenoid sinus. Here's our frontal sinus just up above. And you can see that they are little mucous membrane lined cavities that are separate from the nasal passageway. Going down here, we can see there's our auditory or eustachian tube connected into the nasopharynx back here. So this is how you're able to clear your ears when you have too much pressure or too little pressure. And of course, we can see the palate forming like the inferior wall down below. In the very back here, if you've ever heard of the pharyngeal tonsil, also known as the adenoid, that's right back here. So you actually have a tonsil all the way back here in the back of your throat. And its job, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we study the immune system and the lymphatic system, is to kind of like pay attention to what's coming in through this air that you're breathing. All right, back here, you can see this posterior wall. So this is going to be our nasopharynx. Here's our oropharynx back here, and here's our laryngopharynx down here, down below. And you can see here's the epiglottis kind of up here at the top of the larynx. Now, this is a pretty cool picture, right? Check this out. Get ready. Hold on to your hat. This is going to get a little bit gory. Here's a picture that we got from when we went to Carlo a few years ago. And this is a cadaver that they separated the head and cut the head in half. And look how good this is. Some students did this with just a knife and a saw, like a hacksaw, basically, scalpel and a hacksaw. And they basically cut this cadaver's head in almost a perfectly mid-sagittal way. And you can look, here's our picture, here's the cadaver. It's almost the same picture, which is pretty amazing. But you can actually see, here's our little sinuses. There's our frontal sinus, our sphenoidal sinus. You can actually see here's those turbinates we talked about. We can see here's our palate, hard palate in the front, soft palate in the back. We can see the pharynx down here, and we can see our larynx. Pretty cool. And this is all tongue, which is pretty crazy if you get down to it. All right, moving right along. So that's the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract begins with your larynx. So it's pretty easy to remember, lower larynx. The larynx is also known as your voice box. And so this is the beginning of your air tube below the pharynx. And so when we get down here to the larynx, we find our vocal folds, which are the little flaps of membrane that allow us to produce speech. And these are like really like a pair of really flexible little flaps that are able to vibrate. And you have muscles that are actually able to stretch these and control how tight they are. And so when you make them like really tight, they vibrate very quickly and produce like a high pitch voice. And when you relax them, they produce a lower pitch with your voice. So this is actually how you control your pitch when you're singing or talking. Inside, and actually, let me show you a picture of these. So here is the larynx. So this is what the entire larynx looks like. And you can see it's got a whole bunch of like all this blue stuff is cartilage. Here's your thyroid gland down below. And what we can see if we look down your pharynx, so imagine, look down the larynx. So imagine we had like an endoscope. This is what you would see if you looked inside of it. And these two little like white things are these little membranes that form what are called the true vocal cords. And so as these things get stretched really taut, they control how much air can come through, and they vibrate. So the air passing through this is going to vibrate and make them produce a tone. And they can also relax. And there's actually muscles that pull on them. And then there's these little things over here called the vestibular folds. These are called the false vocal cords. Reason being is because they're also kind of like folds, but they don't actually produce sound. These are actually used to catch if like food or any sort of foreign object goes down your throat, you kind of like stop and catch it here. All right, so going back for a second, if we look at the cartilage that makes up the larynx, there's a whole bunch of cartilage pieces that make this up, but the most important three are called the epiglottis, the thyroid, and the cricoid cartilage. The epiglottis, let's go back and look at that, has the shape of like a leaf, so it kind of looks like a leaf of a tree or something like that. It sits right behind your tongue, so this is just posterior to your tongue and just posterior to the hyoid bone. Okay, and so what happens is that the epiglottis, when you are breathing, air comes in through your nose and mouth. it goes down past the epiglottis and is able to go right down into the larynx, no problem, and into the trachea. And so this is the posterior view. The anterior view, you can see it just sits here right behind the uh, hyoid, sorry, and is just able to allow air to go through. But when you swallow, this whole leaf flips over and lays across and actually blocks it. So you can see in this top-down view, here's the back of the tongue, here's the epiglottis sitting just right up on behind the tongue and leaving this open. So you can imagine if it flipped over and folded down, it would lay right on top of this thing called the glottis, which is up at the top of the larynx, and it would be able to block this off so that you don't swallow food down the wrong pipe. Essentially, is what that is. So it's in charge of covering the airway when swallowing, and it's made of elastic cartilage. The thyroid cartilage is what we know as the Adam's apple, and it's just underneath of this. And here it is. So it's this giant cartilage right here is called the thyroid cartilage, and it's named because it's right next to your thyroid gland. Anyway, the thyroid cartilage, everyone has one. Men and women have it. It's just in men because of secondary sex characteristics. It has some receptors for testosterone, which cause it to grow and become very large. And this is something to do with the men's voice changing and becoming deeper. But one of the things we find is that is one of the major structural components of both men and women for the throat. So it forms like the front kind of like shield. And it's, you can think of it almost like a bone. It gives structure, but it's flexible and gives a lot of shape to the larynx. And you can see from the back, it's got kind of a concave shape when viewed posteriorly, which allows air to pass right down and through this little tube. The cricoid cartilage is this little guy right down here, and it's really fat in the back and skinny in the front, and it's the first ring. It forms like a ring that helps to hold this open. So the thyroid cartilage is kind of shaped like a shield, like it's concave on the back, convex on the front. The cricoid is shaped like a ring, and you can see there's little bits of like fibrous connective tissue that hold these together and basically kind of act as like a funnel to send air down into your throat. Great. And that's the cricoid is where we start the tracheal cartilage. And so if you look at this illustration again, you can see all these little rings back here. This is the trachea. So the tracheal cartilage going down also helps to support the airway. All right, and that brings us on to the trachea. So the trachea is a tube that comes down from the larynx, and it's a little bit narrower than the larynx. So if you look at this illustration right here, you can see how it's kind of forming like a funnel, and it's narrowing as it goes down. Trachea is about 5 inches long. It starts in the base of your neck and goes down into your thoracic region, and it's covered with pseudostratified epithelium, and it's got goblet cells. And the reason why is because this is only an air tube, so it just needs that pseudostratified to kind of cover it. The goblet cells, of course, produce mucus to trap any sort of dust. And of course, we have cilia to help move that mucus along. And we see in the trachea that it has these C-shaped rings of cartilage to hold it open. So let me go back for a second and show you in this illustration. So all the rings of cartilage on the front, you can actually feel these. If you look up, you can actually like touch your throat and feel each one of these little tiny rings. If you just kind of like stroke your front of your neck from top to bottom or bottom to top, it doesn't matter. You can actually feel these in this area. But what's interesting is they form like a very hard ring in the front, but in the back, they're open. And the reason for this is right where this opening is, that's where your esophagus goes down, just posterior to this. And so the crazy part is that when you swallow food, the little ball of food that you swallow down actually causes the esophagus to swell up, and it pushes into this region of the trachea and prevents you from breathing. So one of the things that happens is when you're swallowing, you can't breathe at the same time because, number one, as you're swallowing, this epiglottis has to fold down to cover the glottis and cover the rest of the larynx. And two, is that the esophagus is going to swell into the space and kind of take over the space that was formerly inhabited by the trachea. And then as soon as you're done swallowing that gulp of food or water, the epiglottis flips back up, the esophagus stops pushing into that space, and the trachea is open for you to breathe again. So that's why if you're ever trying to chug water, it's like glug, 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 and you have to like take little breaks to breathe every so often. So the trachea is just what we call the windpipe is kind of its like slang name, because it's like the tube that sends the wind down into your lungs. Once we get down to the bottom of the trachea, there's this branching point right above your lungs and medial to your lungs that where we see the trachea is going to bifurcate or split into what are called the bronchi. And the singular for that is bronchus, but there's a left and right bronchus. And the left bronchus, of course, goes left lung, right bronchus goes to the right lung. And these are what we call primary bronchi because they're the first branch. So all of your air comes down the trachea, half of it goes to one lung, half of it goes to the other. So each lung gets one primary bronchus. And so if we were following it, there's this thing called the bronchial tree, where all the air comes through your larynx and into your trachea. It goes into the primary bronchi, which goes to each lung. Once it gets to the lung, it starts to split into what we call secondary bronchi, which go to each of the lobes of the lung. So each lung, we'll find out later, are broken up into 2 or 3 lobes, and each one is served by a secondary bronchi. That then branches off into tertiary bronchi, which go to like more smaller regions of the lung. And then those branch off into these things called bronchioles, which are even smaller tubes. And those even branch off into these things called terminal bronchioles. So we get all these little teeny tiny tubes going to every single part of the lung. Wow. So this is what that all looks like. So once again, we have like larynx down into the trachea, primary bronchus or bronchi, and then those branch off into secondary. Those secondary then branch off into tertiary. Those tertiary then branch off into these bronchioles, and then the bronchioles branch off into these little teeny tiny terminal bronchioles. And they call it a tree because, of course, it looks like you have one trunk which branches off into these big branches and into like little tiny branches at the end. And the idea here is that we want the air to get split up into every single part of the lung so it's all being covered. Interesting little fact, and we'll talk about this in a minute again when we get to the lungs. But if you look at your left lung, you notice your left lung has 2 lobes. It has 2 secondary bronchi. The right lung has 3 lobes, so it has 3 secondary bronchi, one for each one of these lobes. So it actually has a superior, middle, and inferior lobe. Great. So there we are, the lungs. So the lungs, when you look at them, when we look at the overall shape of the lungs, you notice they're very pointy up at the top and they get pretty wide down at the bottom. They're actually slightly concave at the bottom because of the shape of the diaphragm underneath. So they're actually shaped to the diaphragm. When we look at the lung, the top we call the apex because it's like the point. So remember, like the point of the heart was called the apex. This is called the apex of the lung, but this time it's on top and not on the bottom like it was in the heart. And then the bottom we call the base because it's the wider part, and that sits on the diaphragm. When we look at the lungs, like we said, the right lung is going to have 3 lobes, superior, middle, and inferior, and the left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior. The reason why the left lung only has 2 lobes is because you see there's like this little cutout right here. This is called the cardiac notch, and it's actually because, remember, your heart points to the left a little bit. It makes your left lung slightly smaller than your right, so it only gets 2 lobes, and has a little bit less volume than the right lung. Anyway, then when we look at the outside of the lungs, they have this thing called a pleural membrane, and this is very similar to like the pericardium. So they have a parietal pleura, which is actually surrounding the lung. So there's like a little tiny membrane, like just outside of the lung. There's a visceral pleura, which visceral always means organ, of course. So we're going to find this on top of the lung. So it's like the skin of the lungs. And these are both made of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So it's actually serous membranes. And then in between, we have this thing called a pleural cavity, kind of like the pericardial cavity around the heart. And this is where we have a space with a little bit of fluid that allows the lungs not to get irritated and allows the heart to have space to move. So your lungs, expand into this pleural cavity, and then when you exhale they shrink and the pleural cavity becomes a little bit larger, so they're kind of like expanding and contracting within that space. All right, so let's take a look. This is another gory cadaver picture. This is a healthy lung, and I got to take a picture of this at Carlo. And if you look very carefully, I believe this is a right lung because I see 1, 2, 3 lobes here, okay? And I don't see any sort of cardiac notch, but you can actually see here is I believe this is the primary bronchus coming down into the lung. And you can see the tissue. It's got kind of like some pink color. A lot of this kind of yellowing is from the preservative that they use for this. But this is a nice, healthy pink lung, and you can see how nice it looks. They're very spongy. It's amazing how spongy lungs are. They're very, very thin and frail compared to a lot of other organs that you might encounter. All right, and the reason for all that, the reason why they feel so spongy is because when you get to the end of those terminal bronchioles, you run into these little things called alveoli. And that's plural, the singular is alveolus. But alveoli are the little cup-shaped terminal ends of the bronchioles, and the alveoli are where the actual gas exchange happens. So they're the functional part of the lungs. And so each lung has about 30 million of these. So, quite common, but very, very important. And basically, the alveoli help to increase the surface area of the lung. So, a lot of people think that the lungs are hollow sacs. They are not. They're actually shaped like sponges so that we can have more surface area of epithelial tissue to come in contact with the air. So, if you think about it, if your lung was just shaped like a balloon, only the air on the outside of the lung would have contact with the surface, like the interior lining of the balloon. But because it's shaped like a sponge, almost all of the air that comes in contact with the epithelium and is able to be used. So, once again, we have about 30 million per lung. They're covered with simple squamous epithelial tissues, and it's very, very thin, of course, the thinnest tissue possible for gas exchange. So if we look down here, we can see here's an alveolus, and we can see all these little simple squamous epithelial cells. And right next to them, we can see these little guys here. These are capillaries. So we have a whole bunch of little capillaries in red around the alveolus. And so the whole idea is that air is going to come down this terminal bronchiole, and as it comes down, it's going to branch off into a whole bunch of these little tiny sacs, these little alveoli. As it comes down, there's capillaries that are delivering deoxygenated blood. The blood in the capillaries is right next to the air, and we're actually able to have gas exchange across these things called alveolar cells. Great. We also see that the alveoli kind of bunch together almost like clusters of grapes into these things called alveolar sacs. So each alveolus is kind of in with a bunch of its buddies, and you can see each one of these alveolar sacs is surrounded by a whole bunch of capillaries together in a group. The alveolar cells are the parts of the alveolus that are involved in gas exchange. So those are the simple squamous epithelial cells. We also find that there's these things called alveolar macrophages. And of course, macrophages are big eaters, and their job is to eat up any sort of like infectious agent that gets in. So let's say bacteria makes its way all the way down to the alveolus. The macrophages kind of wanders around and destroys that. It also gets sort of like dust, dirt, any sort of junk that gets all the way down into your lung. The macrophage's job is to clean it up and keep your alveoli open because these are super small, don't forget. And then there's these things called surfactant secreting cells, which basically we found out over time that you have to have a surfactant which is going to reduce the surface tension of the fluid inside your lungs. So your lungs have to stay kind of like moist and wet. But if we just had like plain water in there, there'd be too much surface tension, and the alveoli would actually like collapse in on themselves, which is pretty horrible. So these surfactant secreting cells actually produce chemicals that go into the liquids inside of the lungs and basically keep them so that these really delicate sacs of alveoli can stay open. And you can see microscopically, if we look over here, just how teeny tiny each one of these little alveoli are. And we can see here's the blood vessels running through, here's the bronchiole leading in, and we're just surrounded by all these alveoli. And there's these little ducts, which is like how the air comes in. So the air comes down the bronchiole, it goes into these ducts, and then goes into this little pocket, does its little gas exchange, and then the air comes back out again. And we can see here's another picture. This is from a different textbook of how this is all set up. But some of these, you can see how the air is coming down. It's getting to the terminal bronchioles. It goes down into this alveolar region, and then it gets into the alveoli, and then it's going to be in contact with all this blood, and then it gets pumped back out. And here's an even closer up picture, and you can see just how this works. So we have literally like the thinnest possible cell right here in this alveolar cell. And then right next to that, we have this capillary, which is just made of endothelium, also simple squamous. So we just have two simple squamous epithelial cells back to back. And so this is what we call respiratory membrane. It's just like two little tiny cells. And we're able to very quickly just send oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide back out. We'll talk about how that works in the physiology section. Here's our little macrophage down here gobbling up any bad stuff. And here's our surfactant secreting cell, just making sure that everything works like the way it's supposed to. Well, hey, guess what? You've made it to the end of part one. That's all the anatomy that we need to know. So we started at the nose and we worked our way all the way down to the alveoli. So now it's time for us to stop and take a breather. Yeah, I know. That was terrible. I know you probably feel like this polar bear over here needing to just like lay down for a while after all that. But hey, just go and unplug for a little bit, and I'll see you back here at the next lecture.